Let's talk a little bit about these feather charms before we get started. You can use any material you like to make your charm. I'm going to be using polymer clay today, but you could also use paper clay, you could use pretty paper, you could take a real feather and completely coat it in resin so that it is preserved. You could draw your feather. But I'm going to show you today how to actually make one out of polymer clay. Now you can follow these same exact steps for paper clay. There are tutorials on Pinterest and on YouTube for how to make paper feathers if you wanted to just find some really pretty scrapbook paper and clip into that to make your feather. I'm sure you could find plenty of feathers, images of feathers that you could actually draw if that's the way you want it to go. But today I'll be making my feather out of polymer clay. So I'm using green clay here so that it's easy for you to see what I'm doing. But I really recommend using Sculpey translucent clay or a color of clay that you actually want your feather to be. The translucent is just kind of milky looking, so it would take pretty much anything you put into it. You could put glitter into the clay, work the glitter into the clay. You could work paint into the clay. So the translucent clay is very versatile as far as what you can add to it and the way you can change it. Colored clay like this, you can paint over the top of it. You can also add glitter and different things to colored clay as well. It just doesn't show up as much. So I really recommend finding a color of clay that you want your feather to be. And I'm just using Sculpey 3. It's the softest. Ooh, I'm out of focus. There we go. I just like Sculpey 3 because it's the softest and it's the easiest to work with your hands. Paper clay is actually extremely soft and extremely forgiving. So if you're not familiar with clay, if you don't want to have to bake your clay, then you can find paper clay. You can find that at Michael's, AC Moore. You can order it online. The same as Sculpey, you can find this at Michael's, AC Moore, pretty much everywhere. And Sculpey is polymer clay. Any polymer clay you get will have to be baked in order to set it. Paper clay or other paper mache or air dry clay don't need to be baked. You just leave them out and they air dry. So these are just things to consider whenever you're purchasing the materials to make your feather or deciding what to do to make your feather. Another thing with polymer clay, you can see I've been kneading this clay the whole time I've been talking. You have to prime clay. You have to work it and get it pliable and soft, because when you first start with clay, it's pretty firm. You can see here I can't really squish that unless I try. It's because it's cold. Once it gets warm, it's just nice and soft and pliable and whoops, feels more like Play-Doh or Silly Putty. Not quite that soft, but much softer than the little brick you purchase from the store. So don't let, if you purchase this from the store, if this is your first time working with polymer clay, don't let this brick freak you out. You should be able to pinch the corners of it in the plastic, but if it feels hard, don't freak out. It won't be that hard when you start actually working with it. So you want to prime your clay. A good thing to do is to take it, as crazy as this sounds, put it between your legs or put it under your boob and let it get warm. Leave it in there for about 15 minutes or so just to warm it up a little bit, because warm clay is easier to manipulate. So once it's warmed up in a crevice somewhere under your arm somewhere, then you can start working it with your hands. And you want to knead it for a good 10 minutes or so just to really get that clay conditioned and warmed up and ready to use. So I'm going to, and you see I'm using a really small piece. We're going to be creating a small pendant. Now you can actually wear this as a necklace. You can use it as a charm to hang off of your art journal or to add to an art piece. So if you want a larger feather, make a larger feather. I'm just going to make a small one here because I'm going to be using this as a pendant to hang on my art journal. And I do actually own a rolling pin for this, but I wanted to show you that you don't have to have a rolling pin. Just take a glass jar. Sorry about that. Just take a glass jar and kind of roll out your clay. Now there are a few different ways that you can go about creating this feather. I want mine a little bit thinner than this. So you just want to roll your clay out so that it's as thin as you want the finished feather to be. If you want a nice thick feather, don't roll it out too thin. And you might get little marks in there. It's okay. You just rub them out with your finger. Just like this. And a few marks aren't going to matter anyway because we're actually going to be creating marks and lines and texture in our feather. Alright, so I have my feather rolled out. Just want to make sure there aren't any unwanted marks or lines. So you just kind of rub over the top of it with your finger just to smooth them out. You can kind of go in a circular motion or back and forth. You're just like buffing the surface to rub out any marks. Now there are a few different ways you can create the texture in your clay. I actually have a feather stamp. So if you have a feather stamp, this makes it super easy. No fuss, no muss. You just stamp it and your texture is there. If you don't have a feather stamp, you can use an X-Acto knife, you can use a needle tool, or any other, oh, I'm going out of focus, any other tool with a really fine liner, a fine tip, a fine point, a fine blade, anything that you can create really tiny little marks with. The first thing I want to do is show you how to actually carve a feather into your clay. So what you want to do is, with your mark making tool, you want to keep your blade or your tip flat on the surface. You don't want to be straight up and down drawing on your clay. You want the blade to be parallel with your clay. So I'm going to draw a straight line down, and it kind of curves just a little bit. And now I just want to take that blade and draw in some feather lines, and you want to kind of curve them up. See how I'm curving, like making very wide open parentheses marks. Going to do the same thing on the other side. And you want to kind of line them up one across from the other. Then I'm going to go back again and fill in, because feathers are not perfectly straight. They have a bunch of tiny little hairs coming off of them. But you want to kind of have a guide, and then you just fill it in. Don't be afraid to turn your feather. You just want to make sure to go the opposite way so that your feather marks are all going up. Keep your blade parallel. If you have your blade too far up, you'll get these little marks. If I was to draw straight up in my clay, you can see how it drags and creates that texture there. You don't want that. You want to keep your blade parallel. If you do get some of those marks, you just tap them down like that. It's no big deal, but it also kind of takes away the look of your lines. So, just like so. And that is how you actually create your feather. And you can kind of fill this in at the top a little bit, like that. Now you would just cut this out using an X-Acto knife. So I'm just going to make little notches here, right along the ends of my feather, and then cut straight through right around the line for the outline. Bring the tip down, and then again cutting little lines right into my feather lines. this is just to get your feather out of the clay. We'll go back and define it a bit more, but to get it out of the clay, that's what you want to do. So now you've got all these little tiny cuts in your clay, and you can kind of wiggle it away, which is going to stretch your feather a little bit and kind of give you this wispy look. And just pull and wiggle it away, pulling it up and curving around the way you want your feather to go. And if it feels like it's not pulling away, just come back in and do more little cuts. Maybe you didn't go all the way through, or maybe you didn't have enough. That's alright, you just add some more cuts and pull up and away. Wiggle as you go. So now this is where you just start playing with it, fine-tuning the shape of that feather. Just little tiny, almost like hash marks. Just little cuts. Kind of like you're cross-hatching and drawing your feather in. You can see how I'm finally starting to create the actual shape of the feather here. Just gently cut away anything you don't want. And by using these little lines, you actually get that feathery texture right on the tips. There we go, there's that. So now what you want to do to lift it off of your plate or tray, whatever you're using, is take the flat edge of your X-Acto and slide it up underneath your feather. And there you go. You can see the edge has that feathery texture as well, because we use those tiny little cuts. So that is the hand sculpted feather, and then you can go back and redefine your lines if you need to, if you've kind of lost them a little bit. Just take your mark maker and go back in, create a few more lines. There you go. Now you see that didn't really take very long, but if you don't want to go through the process, oh, I just broke my little stem off. If you don't want to go through the process of hand carving your feather, I'm going to show you another way that you can create a clay feather. Now these techniques can all be applied to polymer clay or paper clay, so you would follow the same exact steps even if you were using paper clay. So my clay is a little bit warm. I'm going to put it back in my warm spot for a few minutes, let it get warm again, and then I'll be back to show you the fast and easy way to create a clay feather. Now I have a feather stamp, and if you have a feather stamp, this is the easiest thing to do, the easiest way to create your pendant. So you want to just take your feather stamp if you've got one. I'm going to turn this a little bit so it's longer. I'm going to lay it right into the center of my clay. Press down with my rolling pin to get a really good stamp in there, to really press that image in, and then lift out very carefully. So my feather is already complete. Now all I have to do is lift my clay off here, because we're just going to cut our feather out. Now if you're using a craft mat, you don't want to cut on your craft mat. You want to lay a piece of cardboard down, or if you have a ceramic plate, that you're going to be baking your clay on, you want to go ahead and lay your clay on there. So I'm just going to follow exactly the outline of my feather and cut away the excess clay. Now here where it's at the feathery bits, I'm using that same technique to create the wispy little looks of the feather edge. Now if you hand carve your feather, you can also go in and cut out the little chunks like my stamp has here. I'll show you when I pull the clay away, but all you would do is go in and cut out a few little chunks of the feather edge to make it look a little bit more realistic, because you know feathers kind of separate in a few places. I'm just following the outline of my stamp. These little tiny cuts. And then you'll make sure your clay is completely cut away. If you need to, do a few more of those little cuts as you're pulling. There we go. Now just clean up those edges a little bit. There you go. Super fast, super easy. No fuss, no muss. Clay feather. Now you'll do exactly the same thing with this. You'll just use the back of your razor blade to lift it off of whatever you've been cutting on. And then you'll bake it in the oven per the directions. If you're using Sculpey, you want to bake this probably for about 30 minutes in a 265-degree oven. Make sure it's nice and flat. If you're going to be creating a pendant out of your feather, then you want to create your hole to hang it from before you bake it. Now, if you're creating a pendant, you need to make sure that you leave enough room at the tip to actually cut the hole, which I forgot to do. So I could put my hole right here, or no big deal, I just roll it up and start again. So I think I'll actually do that because I want to show you how to create the hole. So I have my feather all cut out. Now I'm going to take my needle tool, poke straight through, and then make a little hole to put a jump ring through. Make sure your hole goes all the way through. There we go. Now I'll just pull this up and bake it on 265 for about 30 minutes. I personally like the hand-carved feathers, so I'm just going to hand-carve myself another feather real quick. You could also just make a round pendant like this and sketch your feather onto it. And then just draw your little hole right at the tip there. I mean, make your hole at the tip if you wanted a larger pendant with a feather on it. also just trace the line of your feather. You don't have to go in and make all those texture marks. You can just trace the shape of your feather and be done, if you don't want to have all the little texture marks. Or just have a few. Your feather may end up looking a little bit like a leaf if you're using green clay. That's alright. You can just go back at the very end and use your mark making tool and make it look more like a feather. Please remember that this is just the technique video. For the actual prompt, check your daily email, your daily prompt email, to find out exactly what to do while making your feather pendant. I hope you found this technique helpful. If you have any questions or need ideas for other ways to create your feather pendant, your feather charm, then leave a message in the Facebook group, and between me and the other members of the group, I'm sure we can help you come up with a creative way for you to create your own feather charm that you can use. And if clay is not your thing, remember, think outside of the box. You can use paper, you can use metal like from tin cans, you can draw your feather, you can even print one out and then just write your wish, your intention on the back of your printout, and then you can collage it down into a painting. So don't feel like the clay feather charm is the end-all be-all of this prompt. Do what works for you and create the feather charm or some other feather representation that you like. I hope you found this helpful, and I will see you in the group. Mwah! Bye!